Now, I think my original talk was billed as digital anthropology towards a new frontier. So I'm going to say a bit about that, and then at the end bring in what I've just discovered that the organisers were actually wanting me to talk about, which was Brexit, which is quite a stretch, but I think I can combine them because they basically both come from the same central argument I want to make, which is that one of the biggest fallacies in the world today is that, one, we are living through a technological revolution, a data revolution, which is fantastically exciting, but two, a lot of people, most people think that data is somehow culture-free. Somehow it's lifted out of the messy world of culture and social issues that anthropologists study. And my central point is that nothing could be further from the truth. Now, I should explain that I'm trained originally as a social anthropologist. I did very classic field work with a PhD program at Cambridge University. And that training has very much informed the way I've done my job as a journalist for the last 2 decades. I worked primarily actually in financial journalism, but now oversee the American operation more generally. So I have a sort of bird's eye view about what's going on in the journalism world. But what I really want to draw on today is my training as an anthropologist and look at some of the ways it's informed the way that I look at financial markets and come back to that point about culture and data needing to be combined. But first of all, quick story. I first of all check, how many of you in the room have some training in anthropology or are anthropologists? Okay, all right, I'm precise. Okay, 2. Okay, there's 2 of us against the rest of you. How many of you know about a man called Malinowski, Bronislaw Malinowski? Okay, 3, 4, okay. Well, Malinowski was a Polish anthropologist. He's somebody who's regarded as a sort of founding saint of the anthropology profession. And in 1914, something very important happened, which has a lot of relevance to what you've been looking at today, which is that Malinowski went off as a Polish anthropologist to Papua New Guinea to go and do a study of Papua New Guinean culture. Now, in those days, what you did if you were an anthropologist was essentially, in the Victorian era, sit in your office and oversee the world and come up with grandiose, lofty thoughts about how the world looked in a very macro, top-down perspective. And Malinowski went off to Papua New Guinea expecting to do exactly that. And then what happened was that World War I suddenly intervened. And as a result, he was essentially interned by the British in Papua New Guinea because he was an Austrian/Polish national, who then cut a bargain with him and said, well, if he went off quietly off into a village somewhere in Papua New Guinea where he couldn't take any part in the war effort, they'd kind of ignore him and let him get on with whatever he was doing because they didn't quite understand anthropology, and all would be fine. So Malinowski went off and sat down in a Trobriand village in Papua New Guinea for a long period of time. Wasn't planned, but it completely changed the way he did his research, which was because he was suddenly forced to sit down and live with the villagers on the ground in one place for a long period of time. His assumption that he could do his study by looking with an overarching sweeping view of what was going on began to change. And he suddenly realized, actually, if you wanted to understand the human condition, it wasn't good enough to look at the entire society from the armchair or from an ivory tower. You had to get out, get dirty, look on the ground, and do what came to be known as participant observation. And so he spent many months doing participant observation, bottom up, small, granular, 3-dimensional, hard work, essentially wearing out the shoe leather. He didn't much enjoy it. In fact, after he died, they discovered his diaries of the period, which were actually incredibly rude most of the time about the people he was living with. Not very politically correct. However, the key point is this. He came out after a few years with a monograph that was all about bottom-up observation, close encounters, granular 3-dimensional eyewitness accounts, which was completely different. And when his monograph, The Argonauts of the Western Pacific, was published, it essentially changed the way that anthropology was done. As I say, up until that point, Victorian-era anthropologists had taken grandiose, sweeping views of humankind. Essentially, Malinowski said, no, we need to look bottom-up, micro-level, granular, three-dimensional, and that's the only way to really understand the human condition. Now, the reason I'm saying that is because for the next 8-9 decades after Malinowski came into the field, that approach, participant observation, granular micro-level research, not only defined the way that anthropologists came to do a lot of their craft, not entirely, but to a large degree, and that's how I was trained. For my PhD, I went into, first of all, a Tibetan community, and then a Tajik village, and I lived in a Tajik village for the best part of a year, and literally sat there, observed with my own eyes, and didn't believe anything unless I'd seen it with my own eyes, touched, tasted, felt it, if you like, and actually collected it through close encounter of my own personal kind. That's how anthropology, for the most part, was defined. But it didn't just define anthropology, it separated anthropology from many other forms of human inquiry. Because if you stop and think about the way that economics has been operating, that isn't micro-level, granular, close encounters of the academic kind. It's about taking an overarching, sweeping view of the human condition and working with numbers and essentially working top-down, macro-level analysis rather than micro-level, bottom-up. So you've had this quite interesting split in the social sciences amongst people who study human beings, if you like, between micro, granular, macro, sweeping. And the reason I mention that is because if you stop and think about what the advent of big data has done for the academic world, for the social sciences, essentially, for the first time since Malinowski went off into those Trobriand Islands, you had a chance to start bringing the two approaches together. Because in the past, if you wanted to know a great bit of detail about one person, you had to basically go and stare at them, live with them, grumble about them, encounter them. If you wanted to know about an entire society, you basically had an armchair view. But big data, the art of collecting all those digital crumbs that we leave behind, has suddenly enabled us for the first time to start to bring together the granular micro, about hundreds, thousands, millions of people, together with macro-analysis, which in some ways is potentially incredibly exciting. Or it could be, if people remember that it's not just been a question of micro and macro perspectives which have been dividing up social sciences world. It's also been this issue about whether or not you can measure the world, measure humankind, by actually looking at how people interact culturally in a day-to-day basis and counting and measuring the things in our lives that are actually quantitative. And the reason why this is very important is that, as I said at the beginning, people today, on the one hand, are very excited about the potential for technology to count the world, to measure the world, to look at our human condition, to find better ways of doing things. And yet there's also this great illusion, this deceit, that somehow computers, numbers, are acultural. That you can use big data, that you can use the output of computers, you can use algorithms without thinking about the social context and the cultural context. Now, the good news is that in some parts of anthropology today, and in some parts of the tech world, and I dare say amongst some of you, there actually is an attempt to try and bridge that great divide. And to a large degree, the reason why this great split exists between technology and cultural analysis is because of the tribalism of academic context itself. I mean, when I was at college myself, when I was at Cambridge, you know, the kind of people who worked with computer science, with data, sat in an entirely different department from the people who did hippie anthropology. And we're not just structurally separated. I mean, there was a real sense of cultural, academic tribalism, if you like, in that the people who, you know, did anthropology tended to go around wearing tie-dye and wanted to go and join NGOs. The people who were working in economics were essentially wanting to go and work in Goldman Sachs or Morgan Stanley or McKinsey. And the people who were studying computer science, again, were a different tribe altogether. So there's partly been a cultural academic divide. But The good news is that in parts of the anthropology world, there is signs that that is now beginning to breach. You actually have anthropologists who are going to going and working for tech firms. And at the same time, if you go around Silicon Valley, there's increasing an awareness that getting to grips with parts of the cultural aspect is very important too. And if you look around the world today and talk to some of the people working in digital anthropology, people like Dana Boyd, who some of you may have worked with, who runs a very, very interesting study group just down the road called Data and Society, you can see very easily the incredible power that can be unleashed when you start to combine the cultural and the computing or the data side together in analysis. One of my favorite examples, which Dana wrote about in a fantastic book that was published a few years ago called It's Complicated. Any of you know it here? Because, yeah, well, a few of you do, yeah. One of my favorite examples concerns trying to make sense of how teenagers or tweenies use cell phones today. Anyone who's got a teenager or tween in their life will know that when adults look at, or non-digital natives look at teenage use of cell phones, they tend to feel absolutely frustrated and furious about the fact that kids are on their cell phones all the time. And the natural reaction is to constantly say, you know, why are you on your cell phone? Get off your cell phone, go and do something proper with your life. And then you can talk to any number of parents about the fact that kids are obsessed with cell phones, and there's a sense that actually it's almost irrational, the level of obsession that teenagers have with their cell phones. And if you look at how teenagers use cell phones just in isolation, then yes, it is both frustrating and perhaps a bit irrational too, at least viewed from adult perspectives. And yes, it seems quite obsessive. And yet, if you step back for a moment and don't just look at how teenagers use cell phones in terms of their own particular cell phone usage, but actually look at the entire context of their lives, look at teenage lives in 3D granular close encounters, micro level up, what you suddenly notice is that actually the use of cell phones only makes sense if you look at the entire context of their lives. And by that I mean, if you go back in history 50, 100 years and look at teenage lives in America, one of the very striking changes that almost no one talks about is the fact that 100 years ago, most teenagers had enormous geographical freedom to roam physically around the world. I mean, you could actually, there's been studies done which show that teenagers were quite regularly traveling between towns, often working. They were allowed to move around cities, they moved down streets, they moved around countryside. They could physically move. Even 50 years ago, teenagers were given tremendous amounts of freedom that today we might find quite remarkable. Teenagers would go off and congregate in fields, in bike sheds. They could roam around the world physically. And if you compare that to the life of the average suburban teenager today in America, and look at how overscheduled their programs are, their lives are, look at how there's now this culture that you can't just let kids wander around a city by themselves because something horrible could happen to them. Look at how you have these endless carpools. Look at how their movements are physically constrained. You begin to realize, as Dana Boyd says, that actually the reason why kids go onto their cell phones to roam and explore so obsessively in cyberspace is not just because they like taking endless photographs of themselves and posting on Instagram and Snapchat. It's because actually today we've created a culture where cyberspace is about the only place where they can actually roam and congregate without adult supervision and control. If you want to congregate with your friends in Instagram, you don't have to go and ask your parents for a lift. You can just do it. And so the point is that you can't make sense of one aspect of technological change and usage without looking at the wider social context. And conversely, if you want to understand how technology is impacting society, you have to look at all the pieces together, doing basic 101 anthropology. Another slightly different example is from a book that I recently wrote, or rather it's included in a book that I recently wrote called The Silo Effect. And as part of my book, I was trying to look at the ways that organizations and institutions and people can end up trapped in very fragmented cultural patterns and unable to join up the dots very effectively partly because of structural impediments, partly because habits get deeply ingrained, which make this fragmentation seem very, very normal. And I looked at the way that Bloomberg City Hall, just down the road, had been trying to do predictive data techniques and predictive modelling in recent years. And in particular looked at a very interesting team of people who called themselves the Skunk Works in Bloomberg City Hall, run by a man called Mike Flowers. And Mike Flowers is very interesting because he was actually not originally a data scientist. He was trained as a lawyer, but got brought into Bloomberg City Hall originally to look at financial fraud, and then got very interested in looking at ways to use the city's data more effectively to make the government services run better. And one of the first tasks that he was asked to do was to look at how the city tried to model or predict where there was going to be outbreaks of fires, house fires, and how they could actually conduct inspections by fire inspector department to actually prevent those. And so he got called in. New York City has a long history of having a lot of house fires. He got called in and was asked to work with the fire department to essentially work out where the fire inspectors should go and conduct their inspections, and which buildings were most likely to go up in flames, and therefore where they should target their scarce resources first. So he came in and he had a look at the data they had, all the numbers, all the pile of data, and started crunching them. And he very quickly realized that, surprise, surprise, if you try and predict where in New York you're going to find buildings that are fire traps, using the fire department data, using data from 311 calls, which essentially are from members of the public who are worried about fire traps, if you use that data, it was almost completely useless. Because essentially, the data from 311 calls suggested that most of the fires happened in Manhattan. And in reality, most of the fires actually happen outside Manhattan, in Queens and Bronx, etc., etc. And the reason for that is very obvious. It's because, surprise, surprise, people who are poor immigrants living in the outer boroughs don't want to call up 311 and report anything. Whereas people living in Manhattan who feel secure and have money feel much more happy about placing a 311 call. So they looked at the fire department data and it was useless. So he sat there and he said, well, how about we try and take other pools of data across the city services and see what happens if we try and match them together and do some cross-correlation and see whether we can spot any patterns which might give us clues about where the biggest fire traps are in the New York region. So they got data from places like the mortgage default services. They got places from tax department showing where people weren't paying taxes. They got data from vermin infestation. They got data from childhood poverty statistics. They got statistics on building codes, etc., etc. They put them all together, and lo and behold, with just that one piece of cross-correlation on a single database, they suddenly had a map that turned out to be 5 times more effective at predicting where the inspectors would find essentially fire hazards, fire traps. Didn't cost any more money than a couple of computer programmers in the Skunk Works, and suddenly the detection rates went up through the roof in terms of where the inspectors were finding fire traps. And in some ways, that's an incredibly obvious thing to do. They subsequently went on and they applied the same technique to all other areas of New York City life. One of my favorite examples is something called the yellow grease problem. I don't know if any of you know what yellow grease is. But yellow grease is what happens when you go to a New York restaurant and order deep-fried potato fries, chop suey, spring rolls, anything like that. And you end up with yellow grease at the bottom of the deep fat fryer in the kitchen. And in theory, New York City restaurants are supposed to pay a licensed waste disposal unit to take it away. In practice, most don't because it costs money. And they've all watched The Sopranos. They know what happens to waste disposal companies in New York. And so until very recently, a large proportion of restaurants were actually just tipping the fat down the nearest manhole cover into the sewage system. It's a true story. And so you had these huge, great lumps of yellow grease forming in the sewage system. And the problem was that, a bit like the fire department, the New York City Hall was supposed to go out and inspect the restaurants and work out which restaurants are dumping yellow grease. In practice, there's only about 3 of them. There's 25,000 restaurants, and most of the dumping takes place at 3 o'clock in the morning. So they were very ineffective. But as with the fire department, they took the data they had on yellow grease dumps, which again wasn't a very good predictor. They cross-correlated it with the tax department, with kitchen fire information, with vermin infestation, with a whole range of different types of social indicators. And lo and behold, suddenly you had a system for actually predicting which restaurants were likely to be dumping yellow grease. And they went out and they've managed to reduce the problem quite significantly. Now, on one level you can say, well, that's just a story about data. But actually it's not just about data at all. Because if you go and ask Mike Flowers and the Skunks Works, why was it that no one had done this before? Why did it take somebody to actually think about using that data creatively? What you realized was that although Mike Flowers wouldn't call himself an anthropologist, before he went out and ran these experiments, he spent a huge amount of time thinking very, very hard about the ways that New York City Hall was structured and the tribalism. He was somebody who by chance had spent his whole life trying to jump across boundaries. And he spent a lot of time thinking about the way you had these different tribal patterns. And the thing that's really amazing about this is that until 3 years ago, nobody inside New York City Hall had ever thought about trying to combine these different pools of data. Because in a sense, the tribalism and the structural fragmentation was so deeply ingrained that they just kind of took it for granted. You had different departments producing different data banks, because guess what? New York City Hall was divided up structurally. And yet you had people working inside New York City Hall who so absorbed those cultural rhythms that they kind of took it for granted. And it took an outsider like Mike Flowers to come in and say, well, let's try and look at this problem almost like an anthropologist, see these cultural rhythms, try and imagine an alternative, and then combine that with the data to look at the world differently. That's the optimistic example, the way that you can actually use a combination of numbers and cultural analysis to be quite liberating. The flip side, of course, is that if you don't do that, if you just use data blindly, you can end up with a lot of very stupid mistakes. And there's been quite a lot of work recently that probably some of you are familiar with, coming out from groups like Dana Boyd's group, looking at how essentially a lot of social media, a lot of the internet can end up reinforcing social biases in ways that people aren't even aware of. Ranges from the very crude to computers doing facial recognition and assuming that black people are chimpanzees, to some very unpleasant stuff in terms of how you have inbuilt biases operating with a whole range of consumer services, to much more subtle forms of bias, which again can go unnoticed and unchecked for a very long time because of this idea that somehow computers, culture, technology is data free. And if it's been inputted into a machine, it must be somehow free of culture, even though the people who are inputting it, of course, are very human and very much coming from a cultural context. But the other great example where, in a sense, you see the cost of not combining cultural analysis and numbers is in the financial crisis, and I dare say in Brexit. I know you want me to talk about Brexit. I'll try and squeeze it in somewhere at the end. But the other great problem, of course, is the financial crisis and what was happening before 2007. Because when I look back at the many myriad reasons for the financial crisis, one of them was this problem of fragmentation. And one of them was this problem of tunnel vision. And out of that, there came this very lazy assumption that if the computer said something, that it must be right. And if we built models built on the data from the past, then somehow it must be automatically right too. And there simply wasn't enough cultural analysis, enough appreciation of trying to combine this micro-level observation with this macro-level picture, which could have actually helped to save some of the problems. I remember having a conversation with people in the Fed in about 2008, 2009, about why it was that so many of the mortgage default models had turned out to be so horribly wrong, and why people were so caught short by the sudden surge in mortgage defaults. And I realized that the people who were actually building these models inside the Fed or even inside the rating agencies and banks, for the most part, had never actually got out and done the basic 101 anthropology, the Malinowski-style participant observation and gone out into the communities to actually understand how people were actually living their lives, treating mortgages, how they were lying routinely on their forms, and how the data which was being inputted was not just subject to all kinds of cultural biases, but simply wrong. I mean, one small, very trivial example of this, but actually ended up being very important, was that traditionally it was assumed in all the models the Fed were using and the rating agencies that there was a kind of hierarchy of default priorities in American households, which was that if American households were running out of money, the first thing that they would default on, it was assumed, was their credit card, and then their car, and then their house. And so the assumption was you'd kind of have this waterfall of defaults, and on that basis the models were created, which all made good sense. And if you're dealing with the raw data and you're plugging it into the computer, then yes, the algorithm was culture-free. The reality, though, was that sometime around the turn of the century, a rather fascinating cultural shift began to occur in many parts of America, which some anthropologists in Minnesota have looked at, which was essentially the hierarchy of defaults, and the priority of defaults turned upside down. And instead of assuming that people were, or so instead of seeing people default first on their credit card, then on their car, then on their house, people began to realize actually it made more sense in America today to default first on your house, because guess what, you could walk away, and then on your car, and then on your credit card. And if you stop and think about it, 21st century is a place where most Americans, having a credit card is essential for life. Having a car is pretty important too, because guess what, you can always live in your car today. And having a house, well, it's kind of nice, but actually if that's your second, third or fourth house, you can actually walk away from that probably easier than you can walk away from your car. And if people had been out on the ground looking at what was happening in the real lives of Americans, doing basic anthropology research, they would have seen that. As it was, they were taking the top-down view, and it was missed. In terms of Brexit, what we talk about, I'm very happy to talk about it in questions. I mean, the point about Brexit, I'll simply say, is that as part of this cultural analysis, we also have to have respect for imagination and for recognition that human behavior does change over time. And that's, again, one of the areas where models go wrong, or go most badly wrong, and people get upended by numbers. So I'll end there and just say that for me, coming from an anthropology background, I think that this could be an incredibly exciting moment academically, bringing together the macro and the micro, bringing together the ability to actually look at human condition both from the granular three-dimensional perspective of an individual and the big picture sweep of an entire society. But it will only work if we can find a way to bring anthropologists and computer scientists together. Some places are trying to do this. I mean, MIT is working, those of you who know Sandy Pentland will know he's working to try and push forward what he calls social physics, the idea that you can use this big data analysis to get this very granular, culturally aware analysis of human beings. But there's a lot more to be done. And I hope that certainly all of you in the room, insofar as you come from different backgrounds, will be able to be part of that process. So thank you very much indeed. Very happy to take questions on that or anything else. And also very happy to talk about Brexit.
If I could combine your two subjects and ask you a cultural anthropology and data question about Brexit. When journalists went out and asked people why they voted the way they did, they discovered a lot of people didn't really understand how the EU affected them. And I think many of the people who did vote are getting a better understanding of that today. In light of that, it seems profoundly undemocratic for Theresa May to say, we're not going to vote on this in Parliament. This is sort of an existential issue. It looks like many people didn't understand what they were voting for. I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on whether or not she'll be able to do that and if it's a wise thing to do.
Wow. Well, there are two problems these days with both polling and with voting. The problem with polling, which is incredibly relevant to today's election with the US, is that although you can tell which way people say they want to vote, you can't tell the intensity of their conviction with any significance, with any accuracy. And that turned out to matter enormously in the Brexit vote. because it seems that although the polls were 50-50 beforehand, the Remainers didn't have the same level of intensity of conviction or desire to vote as the Leavers. And the fact it rained, the fact that people just couldn't be bothered to go was quite important. The fact you had a lot of young people who thought that taking part in political action was basically all about tweeting rather than actually going to the polls and voting turned out to be very important. And the problem with voting, obviously, is you simply have a bold yes or no, and you can't really qualify it. And I'm sure that if people had been allowed the chance to qualify it at the polls with Brexit, the outcome today would not look like backing for a so-called hard Brexit, because my limited knowledge of people I've spoken to in the UK in the last few months is that for the most part people weren't voting for a really draconian hard Brexit. People I know who voted for Brexit, and I know a lot of people who voted for Brexit, but actually wanted something sort of more halfway. That may represent or may reflect a lack of understanding of the issues. It's very clear that what happened in the UK doesn't just show the dangers of having a very polarized, fragmented society where the elites are very cut off from ordinary voters. It also shows actually, if you try to understand what's happening in UK politics merely through the prism of numbers and statistics and what the elites would regard as rational arguments, you don't understand where things are going at all. And the Remainers made a very strong campaign based on scare stories and statistics, which came across as very arrogant and patronising and unconvincing for many voters. The Brexit campaign campaigned very much on emotion, which frankly tapped into a lot of the cultural perspective of the people on the ground. And one of the most telling moments in the Brexit campaign was when they got a slogan which said, "Take back control." Their fortunes improved dramatically. And take back control was kind of nonsensical if you look at it from the point of view of elite rationality. But it's a very powerful slogan because it's got momentum, it's got a verb, feels like empowerment. It's very simple to understand. Take back control. It's an awful lot like Make America Great Again, for what it's worth. Yeah, it's Make America Great Again. It's got a verb. It's powerful. It's simple. It's future focused. If you look at the Democrat side, it's an awful lot like the Remainers. The Democrat slogan officially is "Stronger Together," which is a very static slogan. You might as well call it, "Stronger Together as the status quo." It's got a static, hasn't got momentum. And the other slogan is "I'm with her." So you've got two slogans. You're confusing the people as it is. But yeah, do people understand what they're voting for? No. Do people ever understand what they're voting for? Probably not. Is that a shortfall in the way that elections are constructed? Sadly, probably yes.
In light of that, should Parliament vote?
Should Parliament vote? For what it's worth, I think Parliament should definitely vote because we're a parliamentary democracy. Theresa May appears to have ripped up our democratic process, on a shot. Now, given how controversial it is, I think there definitely should be a parliamentary vote. I hope there is. But I think it's going to be messy. And frankly tragic, but
So I very much agree with your point that among a large class of people, there's this illusion that just because algorithms are mathematical, they're somehow objective and immune to human biases and culture and context and whatnot. So that is very much something that we need to combat. But it's only half of the picture. On the other side, there's also a lot of people who tend to think of algorithms as having all the characteristics of human beings. Mm-hmm. Some people have called this the homunculus fallacy. It's seeing what an algorithm is doing and thinking that there's a human being there doing these things. And in particular, there have been a lot of recent examples of supposed displays of bias by algorithms, of which you mentioned one, like Google image search labeled an image of African Americans as gorillas, and wow, look at how biased it is. Mm-hmm. In fact, there was nothing biased about the algorithm whatsoever. The algorithm was just stupid. it actually, that same algorithm is that, it's a type of deep learning that's used for a lot of things. It makes much bigger mistakes, like, labeling an ostrich as a car, which is a much farther thing than labeling a human as a gorilla. It just is very naive and doesn't know that one thing is much more sensitive than the other. And you could say the same thing about a lot of other examples, like like this ProPublica study about how sentencing, these algorithms are biased, and on and on and on. In all of these cases, there is actually no bias in the algorithm. It's we who are actually projecting things that presumably are true of people, into algorithms that aren't. So I think we actually need to combat both sets of misconceptions.
Yes.
Both, assuming that algorithms are objective somehow magically, but also anthropomorphizing them.
Yeah, that's a very fair point. And I think a lot of it's down to the way we do education these days, and the fact we desperately need to bring together cultural studies with quantitative studies, qualitative and quantitative studies. And, social sciences and anthropology needs to be, forced to become much more accepting and embracing of quantitative studies, frankly, and vice versa. But the question about the gorilla and the black person, or the ostrich in the car, really raises the question then again of, if we are going to hand over increasing parts of our lives to machines and computers and algorithms, do we need human intervention at the end to then try and put that into a more culturally acceptable package or not? And so I guess my key point is that it's the same issue faced with, say, Google News and the way that the algorithms would order automatically news stories, and sometimes end up with results that seem very distasteful or bizarre or trivial to human eyes. Though I guess the one key conclusion I draw is that we can't just switch off our culturally interpretive brain when we hand over our lives to machines. There needs to be an interplay. And I think it's incredibly exciting in some ways, because when I was doing my PhD in anthropology, anthropologists were considered to be moderately unemployable unless you went off and became an aid worker. Today, some of you may know that anthropologists are actually getting employed all over the place, precisely because particularly tech companies, but not just tech companies, have realized they need to have much better cultural awareness and sensitivity. And the original motive for a lot of tech companies for employing anthropologists was actually to try and understand consumers. It was almost a modern day version of imperialism, if you like, because anthropology started off really as a kind of tool of the British Empire to try and understand the natives and stop them revolting, or to convert them or tax them, kind of thing. Now it's become, if you like, a tool of, in some contexts, of companies trying to understand consumers. And Silicon Valley companies were discovering that Chinese consumers or Korean consumers had the irritating habit of not behaving in the same way that some 27-year-old engineer in Silicon Valley expected them to behave. And so they had to do some cross-cultural analysis. Then they realized actually anthropology could be useful for understanding how companies work internally, because big global companies have different cultural patterns and they have to kind of understand each other a bit. Now they realize it's really in relation to the machines and technology and computing. So there's some really interesting work being done. People like Geraldine Bell at Intel are looking at this, and that's very exciting. Suddenly anthropologists may actually have a new raison d'etre, and in the same sense, techies who are interested in cultural stuff may find a way to bridge that gap. Sorry.
Hi. I certainly agree with half of your thesis that you can rely on data and get really surprised because you've left out some factor. But the part I didn't get, other than your first story, I don't see why culture has any specific thing. It seems like you're labeling everything that somebody left out of an analysis as culture. I mean, whether you're sitting in a village in New Guinea or whether you're looking at world demographic statistics in a lab somewhere, you're only getting part of the picture either way, and you can make a mistake either way. Isn't the real message that whenever you're working with a model with a partial data set, you should be humble about the conclusions, you should cross-check them against different things, rather than that culture has some unique thing that's different from quantitative analysis?
Yeah, I wasn't saying that either one side is perfect or the other side is perfect. I'll say they need to be combined. And if you like, it's basically a plea for humility on all sides, effectively. And and that is exactly what did not happen in the run-up to the financial crisis, when all the models were being created in relation to CDOs or anything else. There was a kind of blind faith in the models and their outcomes, because of course it suited many people who are creating the models very well. But if you like, it's a plea for humility on all sides.
When you look at the continuum from top down to bottom up, when you look at journalism for the major organizations, whether it's yours or Time Magazine, New York Times, and so on, where do you think they sit in that continuum? And I'm thinking specifically of the, people are finding it surprising what occurred with Trump, and I wonder if there were more of an anthropological view of sitting in Middle America and understanding Middle America rather than sitting in a building in New York.
Completely.
Whether, they would have seen that more clearly.
Yeah, completely. I mean, I'd say it's true of both Brexit and the current rise of Trump. It's shown very clearly that much of the media world is dominated by a small tribal group of people who are caught up in a bubble that's often very disconnected from the rest of the society and the way they work. And, one of the problems these days is that media groups and journalists are very time poor and short of resources and under pressure to produce stuff very fast and under pressure to produce stuff that basically reaffirms what the audience likes already or wants to hear for commercial reasons. And going against that tide is very tough indeed. And Brexit was a tremendous wake-up call for how an elite can get detached and essentially end up misunderstanding the situation. I think, the Brexit coverage for a lot of the media was very top-down. There wasn't a lot of appreciation of what people were thinking on the ground. And that was partly about, ethnocentric biases. It was partly because of lack of resources, sometimes laziness, et cetera, et cetera. And the Trump story, I think, is very similar. We are trying very hard to combat that. And, in fact, for the last debate, in my own tiny way, I went up to Trump country and watched the debate in upstate New York to try and get out of the metropolitan elite perspective and see what people thought about it on the ground. And the first lesson I had, and I've actually written a column about this for Saturday's paper, the first lesson I had was actually just how naive and dumb I was, because I had spent the previous few days in Washington and New York, where everybody I knew was hanging on Sunday night's debate, and everyone was geared up to watch it, particularly after all these Trump tapes. So I said to the news desk, I'm going to go up and find a bar and watch it with the locals and see what they think. So I arrived in upstate New York, in a town, and I go around 5 different bars, and every single one tells me they're not going to watch it. In fact, not only they're not going to watch it, they're not going to screen it on the televisions in the damn bars. And so finally I think this is just too weird. Every single bar in town is telling me they're not going to show it. So I asked them, and it turns out that they have decided that they've deliberately decided, they've all called each other and decided en masse they're not going to show it. So I'm kind of flummoxed thinking, what do I do now? I'm supposed to be watching it and then phoning in my story. And I don't do a lot of reporting myself these days. This is really me feeling very strongly. I wanted to get out and see what was happening on the ground. And it turned out they'd all made a pact because for 2 reasons. One is this area is solidly Republican, pretty solidly Trumpian. But they felt they didn't really want to kind of create any more trouble because everyone kind of agreed already. And secondly, the much better reason was the New York Giants were on that night, and everyone wanted to watch the New York Giants. And it just goes to show how we're all trapped in our own lazy assumptions. And it takes a small jolt like that to actually challenge us and realize, the image I use in my column is that of when I was doing anthropology, we used to talk about the dirty lens. The idea that, in a microscope, you can have a dirty lens that affects how you see things. You have that in your mind too. And the best way to be aware of your dirty lens is to trip up over yourself regularly and to keep reflecting on your own biases. In the end, I found a hotel, which was showing the debate in a bar, but it was a hotel geared to outsiders, not locals. And so I literally sat there and watched it with the bar staff.
So this is a great example.
And sorry, just last on the point, just to say my last point, I will say on this one actually, otherwise my bosses will kill me. What I often tell people, I'll come back to the humility point at the FT, is that on a good day we get 40% of the truth, if we're lucky. And by that I don't mean we get lies, but we only get part of the picture on a good day. I say, what keeps me going? So I think the other papers get 30%. But I hope my bosses are watching. But any time we as journalists convince ourselves that we know 100% is the most dangerous time of all. And that's what we have to remember.
So this really a follow-up question on this story you just told, and also on Brexit. So what are the lessons we learned from these events in terms of better design of polling and forecasting election results? So the example you just described, how do we quantify that? How do we feed that into a quantitative prediction? Have you thought about the kind of the new design of a poll?
Yeah, I mean, I think polling industry obviously got a lot of problems right now. Anyone here work in the polling industry? I'm curious about what you guys all do. If you're not anthropologists, you're not pollsters. I mean, there are 2 or 3 key problems right now with polling. One is the obvious one, which is people don't answer the phone anymore. You know, big problem. I'm sure you all know this already. That basically in the past, people could do polls with fairly good random samples by calling up landlines. Today, no one answers their landline. You have to basically get hold of their cell phone. It's much harder. Lots of people just don't answer their cell phone, period, because they're too busy texting. I mean, serious point. So any data you get is very skewed demographically, and you don't get very good time series, point 1. Point 2 is much more subtle. And I don't know if any of you have ever seen some really fascinating work done by Edelman, the public relations group, looking at trust. And essentially what this shows, they've surveyed 18 countries for the last 15, 20 years. And what this shows is, unsurprisingly, since the financial crisis, there's been a real decline in trust in most major institutions. So you can see bank trust go like that, business trust, government trust, media trust too, we're also untrusted. Very sharp. The one corporate sector where trust has not declined, quite amazing, over the last 20 years, still sky high, is technology. Every other business sector has seen trust decline, which I find extraordinary. But this really interesting thing about Edelman, which plays into this issue about polling and public perception, is that there's been a shift in essentially what I call vertical axes of trust to horizontal axes of trust. And by that I mean, about 15, 20 years ago, if you asked people who they trusted to get information and advice from, they tended to name authority figures, like a CEO or an expert or a politician. Today, if you look at who they trust for information, it's increasingly their peer group, a group known as a person like me. And if you combine that with the technology element, what you basically have is a world where people don't trust authority figures as much as their Facebook friends. It's, vertical to horizontal. And if you think about it in your own lives, that's true, because actually, if you're going to a restaurant these days, and you want to know if it's any good, do you go to Zaggett's and look it up in a book and ask the expert? Or do you go online and see what TripAdvisor says and all the ratings? Same thing with a book. We are increasingly relying on our peer group through social media and technology to judge what's good, what's not. The reason that matters for politics and polling is that in that world, it seems that people are increasingly not just clustering into fragmented tribes online, and we all know that about the fragmentation and the kind of filter bubble and the echo chambers. They're getting their information and advice from each other. And so if they're asked by random pollsters in groups or by themselves who they're going to vote for, there's increasing, I suspect, signs that whether it's an anonymous poll or a group poll, that can be influenced by their peer group. It depends what context you ask people. Edelman talks about a post-truthy world where essentially you have these segregated little cyber tribes talking to each other, reinforcing their own worldview. And you have competing versions of truth, which kind of never even collide. I mean, you see that in the current US election. So the way you ask people how they're going to vote may also be distorting some of the results in terms of whether you ask people singly, together, whether they're getting an online poll from people they regard as their tribe or not. Again, that adds to the difficulty of trying to tell whether people are telling the truth in polling or not. last year when the UK election took place, was it 18 months ago, 2 years ago, it seemed that many people lied to the polls in terms of whether they were going to vote for Tory or not. There was a kind of shame factor involved, where people would, be asked if they were voting for Tory, and they'd say no, and then go vote for Tory. It seems, judging from the polling results, comparing it to the voting data. This time round, I suspect that if there's any shame involved, judging from, again, people I've spoken to across the country about voting intentions, it would be about the Trump vote. That, my hunch is that more people will be voting for Trump than currently admitted. But that's purely my hunch. Many of the people, who here thinks that Trump could win? Anyone thinks? Okay, still. All right. I could embarrass you all by asking who's going to vote for Trump. No, one. Okay. No, okay. No, I'm actually quite serious. I've been going around the country and asking every single. Since we're living in New York and you basically look like a pretty liberal, elite bunch. I guess that most of you are probably Clintonians. But I've been going around the country and asking every single group I speak to which way they're leaning. And I'd say that outside New York, probably about a third usually say they're going for Trump. In North Carolina, and I was in Pittsburgh recently, Philadelphia.
So I very much agree with the bias associated with getting advice from our peers, but I have another question about whether there is a potential second effect, which is that there's often a much faster feedback on the situation in some of the tech-based solutions, right? So you might imagine the reason I go on TripAdvisor is I'm concerned about whether the same chef still works at the restaurant when Zagat rated it, or whether they're still open on Tuesdays. And to what, basically, how do we balance those two things in terms of the social biases associated with where we get our information, but also the feedback it takes for polling versus other mechanisms where you might get a faster read on the current status of people's thoughts on who they're going to vote for?
Well, I think it's absolutely an echo chamber aspect going on. I mean, if you feel that all your Facebook friends are voting a certain way, then there's kind of a sense that you're falling in line, if that's what you mean.
No, I guess what I mean is that another possible explanation, I'm not actually advocating for this, but another possible explanation is that the polls were correct 2 weeks ago. They're just wrong by the time we get them.
Oh, I see.
And that Zagat was correct when they reviewed such and such last year, but the chef has changed and they're lousy now.
Given the speed at which events are unfolding right now and the unprecedented nature of this whole thing, that could absolutely be the case. I mean, we are in pretty uncharted territory in terms of the news flow. I mean, the very fact that you have, WikiLeaks dumping emails left, right, and centre in the last 48 hours, which are pretty embarrassing for the Clinton campaign, but are somehow being drowned out by even more embarrassing stuff, is absolutely astonishing. I kid not. I mean, can you imagine a world where the Russians are hacking the DNC, the Democrats' website, and then separately WikiLeaks is dumping stuff? We have two lots of hacks on the Clintonian side versus one lot of leaks on the Trump side, and they're all kind of clashing with each other. It's absolutely unprecedented what's happening. And frankly, my problem this afternoon was saying to the news desk, for God's sake, everyone outside America, outside the tiny little bubble, elite bubble, who's following this race with breathless addiction. The rest of the world, at this point, is getting really confused about who's leaking what and where and why, because there are so many leaks, so we have to separate them out in our text. But that kind of level of confusion and noise and cacophony and fast-moving events, I think, could create all kinds of bias in the polls.
So maybe then, if I could just ask the question, now that I'm sure that you understand, how do we tell whether the polls were wrong or whether they were right and they've changed, or can we?
I would love to think that there will be future analysis going on in two or three ways. Firstly, I would love to get detailed analysis of polling. If there's a way to get more detailed questions from people in polling, rather than just who will you vote for, yes, no kind of stuff that we tend to report on, that'd be great. I would love to read some on-the-ground, micro-level, sort of cultural analysis of how people view pollsters, whether they lie or don't lie to pollsters, attitudes towards the truth, one-on-one anthropology. I mean, it's a classic territory where you could actually try and combine some micro and macro analysis in a very interesting, powerful way. I'd love to, analyze how people look at polling today compared to 20 years ago, 50 years ago. I mean, I think one of the biggest problems today is that, you have an entire angry young generation who have the illusion of having a voice by virtue of having a mobile phone in their hands and the ability to tweet. And they have the ability to get information about almost anything. But their aspirations or their illusion of having a voice is running head into the fact that in reality they have no agency. They can't change the world. They kind of have the illusion that they can by tweeting. And they have the knowledge to make them angry enough to think they ought to tweet. And a number of people who I've spoken to in the UK after Brexit who say, that, I'm political. I tweet all the time. I have a blog. And you say, well, do you actually vote? And they kind of go, nah. Do you actually do anything, like actually volunteer for anything? Nah. But this idea that somehow you can just tweet. And that's very important because, again, that skews how, it's all very well pollsters going around saying, how would you like to vote in theory? If you can't measure the intensity and the likelihood of them actually going to the polling station on that day, you're not getting a very good picture. I think it's very important for Bernie Sanders voters right now.
Do you see prediction markets as a viable alternative to polling?
Not in the UK right now. I mean, those of you who are looking at prediction markets will know that on the eve of Brexit, the prediction markets were giving something like a 70 to 75% chance of a Remain vote, whereas the polling was 50-50. Interestingly enough, some of the private polls that were commissioned by hedge funds in New York, you may know, actually came out as in favour of Brexit. So the only people who had it right were actually the ones who were doing private polling, which were not published. And I know this with some bitterness, because I actually went on to Closing Bell, the television show on CNBC, a few hours before the Brexit vote came out. And I was with Roger Altman, who, as some of you may know, is one of the great financial luminaries of New York. And he sat there on set and said with absolute confidence, well, the prediction markets have said it's going to be Remain. The financial markets are trading as if it's going to be Remain. It is going to be Remain, because you can guarantee that the markets are right. And partly because I was just wanting to be a bit sort of contrarian and get a more interesting show, I kind of said, well, you can't always guarantee the markets are right. Prediction markets may not be right. But I must say, although I argued that intellectually with my heart, I too thought that it was going to be Remain, because I'm also part of that deluded elite, frankly. So I thought it probably was going to be Remain. Anyway, if you look at why the prediction markets were so wrong, again, it's a reflection of elitism, it seems, because the kind of people who put money to work in the prediction markets are not the ones living in Sunderland who are actually voting. They tend to be the people who are, wealthy, elite, etc., etc. And in the case of Brexit, that mattered a lot. So that's my best guess for why the prediction markets were so wrong for Brexit. You can see what they say right now in the US context. I suspect that they may be wrong again. My best hunch is that they won't be wrong about the outcome, but I think they may be wrong about the magnitude.
Unfortunately, I think we need to stop here. Gillian, thank you again so much for taking the time.